we need to move from just being a crisis to centering Africa in this debt, in the sense that what does African countries seek to gain from getting debt, and what inspires this? Of course, some of them are already listed above. And therefore, the other point that comes to mind when saying that is the fact that there's this debate about debt thresholds rather, which is still moot out there, and therefore it's a debate that cannot be ignored going forward. And so the importance of debt as to whether African and Zimbabwe, for that matter, needs debt cannot be overemphasized. And then the presenters also made a very good point on FDI as well as Chinese ambitions. And I want to say that the FDI, of course, we need to, in my view, marry FDI with loans, in the sense that, like Lauren has clearly pointed out, these countries, for African countries to be productive and to be attractive for foreign direct investments, they need to have adequate or proper infrastructure. And this infrastructure can only be developed by loans, which of course these countries are continuing to get. And so the Chinese financing, for instance, ought to be looked into in the context of what is it coming to do, or rather, how do African countries want to relate with it? Are we using it to develop infrastructure? Are we using it to develop agricultural productivity? Are we using it to spend on social spending, on schools, on health, to create educated workforce, so that at the end of the day, we will be focusing on what Lauren mentioned is the China of 1980s, as opposed to just taking debt for the sake of taking it. And then the third point is that there has been discussion about secrecy of debts and debt contracts. And of course, this follows a report that was released also earlier on this year. But again, what we need to remember is that and like it has been pointed out clearly in the paper by Lauren, these secrecy and transparency aspects it cuts across. It's not only, it's not China-centric as it were, but I think it's a debate that needs to be approached from a global point of view, in the sense that if you're talking about transparency and accountability by the creditors, then we need to have perhaps a global framework, because that will center the debate as to what the problem is, as opposed to apportioning of blame here and there. And then fourthly is that Lauren has also in the paper discussed about coordination. And I think I need also to emphasize that in terms of coordination, there's need for not only China, but also other lenders to coordinate in terms of the borrowing, the debt relief discussions, the DSSIs, etc. But more importantly, the coordination also needs to be centered from the point of view of the takers of the loan, the recipients, the African countries. And we all know that in Africa, whereas a lot of debt is being dispensed, perhaps the countries are not even having a common position on how do we deal with this debt. How do we approach debt restructuring, for example, especially right now when the continent is ravaged by effects of COVID. So yes, coordination is important, but it needs to take place not only at the creditors level, but also at the recipients of the debts level. And then finally, on the presentation, I wish to note that there are other issues, other issues which our researchers have produced. For instance, there's a second report other than the one I mentioned, which Development Imagine produced in June, centered around African agency. Because to me, I think what is clear is the there's lack of agency in the sense of the recipient countries are not very, we are not very sure or very focused or very deliberate on how to apply the borrowing that the benefits of the borrowing, that's the loans that come from these countries. And so African countries need to, having learned from the effects of the structural adjustment programs, our report does indicate that there's need to center agency, there's need for coordination on the continent, there's need for Africans to reimagine how they want to interact with more so China and also other development partners in terms of, do they want to capacity build? Do they want to use this debt to only do infrastructure within national, or do they want to do infrastructure that cuts across the continent, and therefore that marries with the continental ambitions in terms of boosting intra-African trade, etc. So I think those are some of the points I wish to point across, and agree with the sentiments made by Lauren in terms of what we have right now is what is from the perspective of the lender. But now it's perhaps a time for us to reimagine how African countries who are recipients want to engage, because it's not about just taking in one loan after the other, or taking in one credit to the other, but rather how to apply this credit in a more effective manner. And I think that is what will take the continent forward. And also, finally, in terms of the second part of agency, which I wish to make in conclusion, is as regards the issue of public finance management. And I think that agency goes down to the lowest person in the country, the very poor. So how do you do that? You do that through having proper legislations. You do that through having responsive governments and responsive parliaments and responsive laws. And I think citizens' power and citizens' agency also is very crucial. And I think after that, the discussions that are going on in this forum are partly beneficial towards delivering that ambition. So with that, I think I will stop there and say that the paper is really good, and I look forward to interacting with it more. And I also welcome you to look at the works that Development Reimagined has been putting out regarding debt and African agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, for those reactions. I call upon Professor Brotegom for your reactions, 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you. Professor Brotegom. Dennis, can you check if she's online? All right, I think she's
yeah, online. Should I start?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I'd like to share my screen. Is that all right?
Sure, you can do so.
Hi, so thank you very much for inviting me to be a discussant at this conference. This is my third visit to Zimbabwe, and it's the first one that I've done virtually. So I have to say it was so much easier to come this morning than for my last two visits, which involved, in one case, a very long road trip from South Africa. So I'd like to make a few comments which are focused very much on the question of the impact of Chinese debt on development in Zimbabwe. And I thought in order to do that, it would be useful to share the data that Lauren referenced in her remarks with you. So what I'm sharing with you right now is the China-Africa Research Initiative's loan database. It's an interactive database which is available to the public. It's now hosted by Boston University. And when you hover over these different countries, you can find, for example, here's Zimbabwe. So our estimate of total Chinese lending in Zimbabwe is $3 billion with 29 loans. It is very difficult to do this research, as Lauren mentioned. It's a lot of this is confidential. We don't have good reporting from Zimbabwe or from China. So it involves a lot of digging, but let's look and see what we've dug up. So we click on Zimbabwe, and down at the bottom, you can see the sort of clumpiness of these loans with a little chunk in 2006 and then more in 2012, 2013. Both of these 2006 and 2012 are years of the FOCAC. And so there's some relationship, including a visit to Zimbabwe in 2012. And then in 2017, we see the largest loan. So let's see what China is funding and what is Zimbabwe borrowing for. So the largest sector by far is power with 1.4 billion. And then we see telecommunications with 442 million, and then transport with 356 million. So I think in my quick calculations, about 85% of the funding went to two sectors, transport and electricity. And then if we look over here, we can see all the various loans. So we've got, just on this part, we've got the country, the lender, the sector, and the purpose of these loans. There are other fields that one can look at up here, including, is there resource security here, the interest rates, and all of these kinds of things. But those relate to if you want to download all of the data in an Excel sheet. So we'll just look at this sheet for a while up here. So if we scroll around here, what we can see is a little bit more. The top 6 loans in terms of the size of the loans are the Hwange coal-fired power plant expansion, the Net1 telecoms expansion, the Kariba South power plant, Harare airport upgrade, Vic Falls airport upgrade, and then 200 million for agricultural equipment, which was back in 2006. And so if we look at these sectors, what we're seeing is that the Chinese lending is very much going for investment by the government rather than consumption. So governments have to do both sides of these. But if you're talking about job creation, investing for the future, investing in the expansion of power and Zimbabwe's ability to have electricity so that you can have conferences like this, or telecom so that you can have people like us coming into this conference. And then airport upgrades for tourism. And I'm not sure how essential that is for Zimbabwe's economy, but I know Vic Falls has been a big contributor in the past to that. Agricultural equipment goes without saying, that's something that's for income and job creation. So Lauren talked a lot about job creation and what's needed for job creation for the future of African youth and youth in Zimbabwe. And I think it's very interesting that 85% of this is going into sectors that are related to creating jobs for Zimbabweans. And there can be debate about the quality of those jobs in the tourism sector, but many of those are attractive. But then power, electricity is pretty essential in the modern economy for all sorts of things, using power tools in a small shop, communicating with each other. Electricity is pretty central for modern businesses in Zimbabwe to have that and not to have power cuts. And so I think there's another aspect of this, which is which Chinese banks are funding this. So as we can see, and I crunched the numbers on this, 87% of the finance by value has been provided by China's official export credit agency, China Export-Import Bank. And the rest is pretty much suppliers' credits from Chinese companies. So we don't see any lending from China Development Bank in Zimbabwe. I know they've come to Zimbabwe. I've spoken to China Development Bank representatives, and I've spoken to Zimbabwean government officials about their desire to borrow from China Development Bank. But from what I can see, China Development Bank didn't find Zimbabwe a creditworthy borrower. And so they have never, at least on commercial terms. And so they have never lent to Zimbabwe. And so it's China Export-Import Bank. And China Export-Import Bank lends, as Lauren said, some on concessional rates or preferential rates, but a lot of their lending is on commercial rates as well. And we don't have a lot of detail on the rates for these loans in Zimbabwe. So that's something that can affect the sustainability of this in debt terms. You know, what were the terms? How high is the interest rate? How long does Zimbabwe have to repay these loans? And so I'll just mention now my last point, which is, how are these loans being repaid? And I followed the situation in Zimbabwe fairly closely over the years. And I've seen a lot of back and forth between Chinese lenders, particularly China Exim Bank, and the Zimbabwe side in terms of Zimbabwe's difficulties in repaying these loans. And what we can see is that it appears there have been various mechanisms set up with various forms of security. But it does seem as though perhaps a large part of the security for these loans is a standard project finance mechanism, which is that revenues from the project go into escrow accounts to repay the project. So if we look, for example, at the agricultural equipment or the Harare, the airports, they all have revenues. The Vic Falls, certainly revenues from the airport, and then the power plants, also revenues. And so these revenues in other countries have gone into escrow accounts, a portion of them, in order to repay the loan. And as long as Zimbabwe was using the US dollar, that would make it more attractive because it would be Zimbabwe's local currency, which is was US dollars, going into those escrow accounts, which may explain why China Exim Bank regarded Zimbabwe as being a little more creditworthy, because they didn't have the exchange rate risk, at least for a chunk of time that wasn't present. So I think I'll make one more point, which is just, again, on the infrastructure gap in Africa. And as we can see that reflected in Zimbabwe, that this is what China is lending for. It's infrastructure. We go back to this. Again, power is the largest sector, communications, and then the airports. And then there are others as well, with defense being a chunk. So I'll stop, and I look forward to the conversation continuing, and including, I hope, in my next actual visit to Zimbabwe.
Thank you a lot for that, Deborah. Without us wasting much of our time, I call upon Honorable Karatigwa to react to the presentation.
Thank you very much. The issue of debt is very pertinent, not only to Zimbabwe, but on a global level, like most of the presenters have been touching on. I must say, SADC is in a challenge for its development. It has trapped itself in debt. First, the debt left by those who had colonized it, and sometimes a legacy of struggles fought against their own emancipation. The quest for development, which is to a large extent Eurocentric, has kept us backwards, and consumers of goods and services influenced from there. That has perpetuated our poverty and the current debt trap we are in. I do not want to paint a gloomy picture and hope in Africa's self-assertiveness that is subtle. It may not work for us to be abrupt and to be aggressive in our foreign policies towards the West and the developed Asian countries. And the best way is to allow competition for investors which can strengthen our negotiation space for higher stakes. I think we all know where we are coming from. If perhaps we narrow down to our local perspectives, whereby in the wake of legacy issues and challenges that have been bedeviling the country, that we have inherited, even when you go back to colonial times, where was it Dr. Gordon Moore said, you don't want the current generation or future generation, for that matter, to inherit anything emanating from that past. And whereupon someone was saying, no, we should oblige, we should honor our dates. It's a give and take. It's actually debatable, but I must say, if there was no peace yesterday or back then, it would have meant, maybe it would have been difficult to construct a development like these facilities that we are using today, the roads, infrastructure, and so forth. So there was need for peace. If you flip it the other way, you may realize that perhaps what they were doing, though it was not fair at that particular time, like what somebody said, perhaps in terms of import substitution during that particular time, it actually helped to lay that foundation in terms of the economy. But maybe let me jump to maybe our own situation now with the new dispensation, whereby we have to face a lot of socio-economic challenges, and we have to deal with them. The question is, what starts first? We are probably in a chicken and egg situation. Do we want to douse the fires of debt first, or you want to feed the children going forward? I think you need to strike a balance. The new warfare is now embedded in the known solutions to pressure for Africa to address the challenges facing its children, women, youths, working class, and pensioners. And of course, we must also, when we look at our own local national context, consider or take cognizance of the fact that Zimbabwe is heavily informalized. We, especially the mining sector, there are a lot of informal businesses. And while employment might be on the downside, but our economy is also ticking because of that. And one presenter alluded to the fact that there's probably no data. If that data is properly captured and accounted for, I think it can give a different perspective, which can actually help any further research to perhaps formulate frameworks or strategies that can actually help us chart a better course going forward. These solutions are, however, used in a greenwashing manner, leading to debt build-up. Africa has to strengthen its ties towards national development, although intra-national and internationally as SADC, we are also divided, and these predators are not without strategy. Hence, Africa should equally have a strategy, and Zimbabwe, for that matter, must have a strategy. What is reflected in our debt records hides deep inequalities now witnessed in reality among different groups of society globally. We, however, need to start from where we are and pragmatically address these issues. Corruption is there, I don't condone it, but the sugar coating also to prevent deep interrogation of the structure of the world that favors some over the other. when we talk Chinese investments, and perhaps focus on China, maybe we should, when we say we need strategies that are perhaps homegrown from an African perspective, perhaps these are coming in as counter strategies or complementary strategies, because if you look at the way China is developed, maybe if you go back a couple of years, 30 years or 50 years, you realize that they were probably worse off than even us, Zimbabwe, as a country. But it took a lot of strategy, good implementation, good work ethics, and a certain level of resolve for them to actually turn around their situation. And now what we see is China perhaps foreign policy, which is perhaps commercially embedded or derived. It's anchored in perhaps the global architecture of business, the realization that economies grow and they are grown by their own local people. Economies, they are driven by your own strategies. And if you don't do that, economies can also go under. And this, you have seen China's foreign policy focusing on probably hedging their own economy. What should our strategy focus on? It must actually complement China's foreign policy, because that avails perhaps international capital. International means for us to also grow our own local infrastructure, drive our own social economic approaches in a direction that is complemented by those available international capital, more so in the wake of perhaps challenges that we may face in accessing international capital in other jurisdictions. So our counter strategy or complementary strategy will then result in that win-win situation. But perhaps in the interest of time, I must say it must be backed by due diligence, and it must be backed by goodwill, political will. It must be backed by a willing citizen with a paradigm shift that will see a good mindset that actually makes us proud or makes us willing to actually negotiate at par with those potential investors from China, so that what we offer is also spoken to by our own laws. We strengthen the gaps in our own laws. We make new laws that can speak to the challenges that we pose. These, we may also look at them as predators, but perhaps it's only fair to say, what do we derive out of that? I must also maybe allow me to comment on the investments or the sectors that were mentioned that have seen Chinese investments in our country. And when you look at them, they are actually highlighting our need areas. For example, if you look at SDGs, SDG goal number 7, it speaks to energy. And that is the reason why we've seen Zimbabwe maybe attracting a lot of debt in that direction. It's positive, but it needs to be managed. So perhaps in the interest of time, allow me to end there. I could go on and on. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Honorable Mkaratigwa. You highlight quite important points. Counter or complementary strategies, but also the need for due diligence to do so. Political will and leveraging on our comparative advantage. Win-win, it could be a story for another day, but I take this opportunity to invite Dr. Sila to also react to Lauren's presentation and more. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the good presentation. Now, I want to focus on Zimbabwe, and I want to focus on the all-weather friend mantra, as China is referred to in some quarters here in Zimbabwe. Now, the second biggest development problem that Africa is experiencing after coloniality is the absence of value addition frameworks and a sustainably resourced value chain. Now, historically, the idea behind international development discourse has been to keep sub-Saharan African countries as producers of raw materials and primary goods, producers and exporters of such. Hence, it seems like any new economic superpower that comes into the picture aims to keep sub-Saharan African countries that way. Hence, if you look at the Chinese backed projects, Chinese loan rather, backed projects, they largely focus on capital projects which do not have a clear value chain empowerment or value addition or multiplier effect. Hence, in this day and age, a true all-weather friend will help its bilateral partner to escape the debt traps through funding value addition and economic diversification projects. So, do not give me a loan to refurbish an airport without helping me to, or obligating me to build an airplane assembly manufacturing plant together with that airport. Do not give me $1.5 billion to refurbish Hwange thermal power plant. And I think we might be heading for a major shock as Zimbabwe when it comes to Hwange thermal power plant refurbishment. As you know, the United Nations issued a code red report on climate change, which might actually put in place the final nail in the use of fossil fuels, and coal is the highest fossil fuel on the agenda to be banned internationally. So we might end up with a $1.5 billion debt for a thermal power station that we might not use in the near future. But a good all-weather friend would have rather directed us to the race for the establishment of renewable energy power plants. Give us funding to establish a lithium battery manufacturing power plant. We've got the highest deposits of lithium in the, almost the highest deposits of lithium in the world. So that's what the friend does. So at this point in time, it seems like the trend shows that China does not really have the interests of Zimbabwe at heart in getting us out of this debt and development conundrum. And any financier to engage with Zimbabwe should ensure that the financing should be done with a value addition protocol in place. And anything other than that is going to be detrimental to our development as a country. So I would possibly like to pose a resolution that from 2021 onwards, parliamentarians and all stakeholders will not enter into any loan engagement that does not have clauses on value addition or value chain support. If you sign any loan agreement that is focused on a capital project, not supported by any value chain support, then you are simply driving the country towards stagnancy, taking into consideration that development is positive change in the political, social, economic, and lately environmental realms of human existence. And then there's the issue of debt relief and cancellation. Again, a true friend will help out a struggling friend. In the event that Zimbabwe struggles to pay back its debts to China, we need to see clear debt relief and cancellation frameworks and models that are not to the detriment of Zimbabwe and that are fair and reasonable to both parties. And this is taking into consideration the fact that most of these loans are collateralized against future commodity exports structured around commodities like gold, platinum, etc., which are high value commodities for us as Zimbabwe and can help us develop through savings and investment from the proceeds of such. Hence, focusing on the issue of debt relief and cancellation, we have seen China cancel just about $50 million in debt out of billions of debt owed to China by Zimbabwe. And it seems like with the failure of Zimbabwe to pay back loans to China, our commodities are going to be shipped as quickly as possible to China through the same infrastructure that they have given us loans to build, the same roads that you've been given loans to construct are going to be used efficiently to ship minerals from Zimbabwe to China. So at the end of the day, I remain skeptical. But I also blame our local leadership for failing to understand that in this day and age, it's about value addition, and that's the only way a country can develop.
Thank you, Dr. Sila, for that quite in-depth reaction. An all-weather friend has to help you in any kind of weather. I don't know, for some of us, the 9 were born in a rainy season, and it has always been storm Zimbabwe relations. Good points on value addition. The projects, Wange South versus fossil fuel financing. I think as AfroDad, we're part of the climate finance working group within the African continent, and we are also worried about the push against fossil fuel financing, and there are limited incentives from that shift of fossil fuel to greener energies. But this is something that we can now open to the floor, and I don't know if we can have maybe 1 or 2 rounds of questions. I recognize Tiri, and then the gentleman behind Dr. Cotton Moyo.
Okay, thank you very much, Adrian. And also thank you very much, Dr. Lauren and Dr. Deborah, for the excellent presentations. Mine are asking for maybe comments from the two, especially on the role of China with regards to the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the New Development Bank, that China contributed very much to their establishment. And maybe a comment on those financial institutions, not only with regards to Zim, but Africa-wide and maybe globally. The other aspect has been touched on with regards to China's strategy towards debt cancellation. Recently, we have seen it taking part in the debt service suspension initiative and the G20 common frameworks, and China is part of those debt relief measures. Do you see its role in these initiatives as coming to the table with regards to the traditional donors we have seen in the past? And also there is a big war with regards to the COVID-19, especially the war, the vaccination war or the vaccine war. We have seen between China and the West and China and the US, and even the origin of COVID. Do you have any comment around that? Because we are in maybe as Zimbabwe as the continent, and how do you see this unfolding, not only in the context of debt, but also in the COVID fight? Thank you.
All right, thanks, Tiri. Can we make our questions a little bit shorter?
Thank you for interesting presentation. I just want to make an intervention with regards to Chinese strategy towards Africa vis-a-vis the BRI. To me, I agree with Dr. Lauren's conclusion to say, let us look at the Chinese strategy as Africans, more so as Zimbabwean. What do we learn? We learn that if you are interacting internationally, you should have a strategy that benefits your own country. So China is right. China does not have any responsibility to develop Zimbabwe or to develop us. They have the responsibility of developing themselves. It's us Zimbabweans. When we interact anywhere, whether locally, with the British, with the Americans, or anywhere, that we have a responsibility to develop our economy. Hence, I agree with Doc that yes, we can place that condition. We need to attract investment in value chain. We need to attract investment in energy, renewable and all that. But we can't blame China. China is doing what is best for itself. Thank you.
Honorable Chindakwa, and then Emmanuel. And then we call for responses from Lauren.
Sure, thank you. I think my contribution, mkuru ava contributor vava farsama sports, because that was my contribution. Because if you don't stand for something, you fall for anything. Thank you.
That's very true.
Yeah, thank you so much. Mine is, I think it's really critical that as far as we talk of debt, I think as a country, we should actually embrace a culture of consulting our own citizens. We should be given a maximum tendency of saying something. We need to be consulted before committing to some of these debts as a nation, not to impose. Kuzotaura kuti takazotora mari yakati kuChina nechichi, yet there is no even transparency, there is no even tendency of accountability. We ask the critical questions. What is it going to work for? How long is it? To what extent are we as citizens benefiting out of it? But most of the things, I think to some extent that particular culture should stop and put the citizens in the center so that the citizens can then decide, is it feasible for us to commit credits, to commit these particular debts? For us, are we going to benefit something as far as the social sectors are concerned? Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I see no appetite for a second round of questions, so Dr. David, if I'm not mistaken, will be our...
Thank you very much, and thank you to all presenters. I was particularly touched by Dr. Sila's presentation. I think it's quite pertinent as a generation. And maybe just to add that there is this thing called the national interest, and I think as African countries, we have not really been able to define our own national interests. And foreign policy, the foreign policy of any given country is tied to the national interest. And because we have failed to define that, I think we have tended to fall for everything, like what Honorable Shidakwa was saying. And I see no reason why, perhaps before that, I wanted to say there is a discourse that has been developed quite extensively by Professor Sabelo Gacheni-Ndlovu. That talks of decoloniality. I think some of the mentality that has been shown by our leaders as Africa, we have always presented ourselves as victims to the international community. We have always presented ourselves as beggars. Unless and until we begin to work on our mentality, I think we'll always be like that. I don't see any reason why, for example, we should have the Chinese constructing a national parliament building in a country of immense resources like us. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. I think you highlight an important aspect of taking a victim kind of syndrome. As AfroDad, we are running with a mantra of Africa, the rule maker, not the rule taker. So be that as it may, Lauren and Deborah, can you kindly respond to the questions that have been posed to you? Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, great. So first on the G20 and tying that into the debt relief story, and is that a symptom? Is that a signal China's coming to the table? I don't think so. I think China works pragmatically, typically at the bilateral level, with what is the most pragmatic way forward in that bilateral lending or aid context. And in the context of COVID, the most pragmatic step was to work in that framework. But after COVID, that probably won't be the most pragmatic from a Chinese lens compared to the traditional bilateral lens. And equivalently, China also itself did not borrow to the extent it needed a lot of debt relief. Like its own borrowing was, I mean, they have a lot of domestic borrowing as well, but it kind of like, I think it doesn't partly offer debt relief because it believes repaying the debt forces you to force your growth rate up. Like it's almost like a disciplining mechanism. So I don't think it's not strictly perhaps that they don't position themselves or they don't see themselves as an all-weather friend or whatever. The need to repay the debt as a means of disciplining oneself to get the original investment intent and so on. Obviously, if the circumstances shift dramatically out of control unfavorably, that's a different situation. But I think they see debt repayment as a disciplining mechanism simply to just kind of get things going. That's their lens, I think. I mean, I'm not Chinese government official, but that would be my response to that. And on the AIIB NDB question, I think AIIB issued its first loan recently to an African country, and the NDB, which is a little, I mean, it has South Africa as a leading member, but it's a slightly different bank, which also does emergency financing relief, more like the IMF. So the AIIB is a bit more like the World Bank, and the NDB is a little more like the IMF, or could become. In the short term, I think China's using those to learn about development finance and multilateralism on its own terms. So I wonder over the next 10 years how CDB and China Exim and so on will change as a result of what they learn. So I think that's also about China's own learning, as well as a place to simply deposit all their savings and create, they're looking for new investment opportunities. And these organizations is just another way to invest abroad. So it's another way for China to go out into the world and find new growth. So to that point, I'd go back to all the different speakers who've emphasized the need for African agency and to create those, value chains and so on. But I would also emphasize that, in the 1980s, China didn't turn its back on foreign investors. They used foreign investors incredibly well for themselves, helped by the fact they had Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore on their doorsteps. And that's a very different kind of relationship. It's almost as if Mauritius would be Zimbabwe's leading foreign investor rather than China, like a much much smaller gap. They had these, overseas Chinese investors leading the initial outreach in terms of foreign investment. So just like a different cultural gap. But they didn't at all turn their back on foreign investors. But they did it with a very explicit and very driven goal of developing their country. And they did it very incrementally. So they didn't expect to have, like in the 1980s, they were happy with a shoe factory. They didn't want a BMW factory in 1980. They were like, let's get the agricultural productivity. So I agree on the one hand, you can read Chinese investment in bridges and ports as just a way to suck the diamonds and the oil and all the rest, just as has always happened in recent few hundred years. They don't have to be used that way, and they don't necessarily, they're not strictly necessarily built with that intent either. And it's up to African agency not to make sure they aren't used for that. Like, I don't think it makes sense to not build a bridge or a port because it can be used to exploit you. It's a question of building the bridges at the right time such that you aren't exploited and so on. And remember, it took China 40 years to get to this. It's very easy to forget the way China related to the world, and they just took loans and built projects kind of gradually as they could afford to do that. So, there's parts of China today that are much more developed than other parts because they didn't just decide to kind of build roads everywhere overnight. They just did it. They did it very, very slowly and methodically so that it would be on their terms. So that's why, that's why I say go back to how China was in the 1980s for your own kind of strategy in that sense. You can see the way they borrowed at that stage. You can see how they designed all their foreign investment joint ventures to make sure there was a local component. And obviously, Zimbabwe is not China. It has its own negotiating position with foreign investors and its own challenges. But I just say don't throw the baby out with the bathwater because China itself didn't. China didn't get where it is today without foreign investment. And maybe Zimbabwe or anywhere else can do that. I'm not saying you can't. But indeed, the point of agency and sequencing and value chains, but kind of that within a strategy, not as an ideology. I guess that would be my kind of closing point on those summaries. Like, absolutely develop that lithium for yourselves and your own development, and do that as cleverly and as with the same level of drive. Like that's how China did it. They drove that, and that's what kind of, remember how they were in the 80s and drive that same, to 2063, drive that same process they did, not as an ideology, but as like a really pragmatic, sequenced strategy. And there was one final point, if I can, on that. Like, someone brought up import substitution and competitiveness and so on. I go back to that demographics point. Like, even any African country in the 1990s that was competitive in terms of electricity and roads and wages and so on, still would have had trouble competing against China. Like, it was just almost impossible to compete with China's low wage demographic dividend. Like, just too large, too competitive, too cheap, too enormous. And so in a way, Brazil and so on were unlucky because their demographic dividend coincided with China's. That's really unfortunate. That's not the case in Africa. So your demographic, your youth bulge is sequential. It can be used. So, you now face a world full of old people. In the next 50 years, there'll be so many old people in China and Europe and North America and Japan. Work out your national strategy. Like, China sold everything they could produce to the baby boomers. Like, the West was young, it was rich, it was confident. it was Bill Clinton, it was Tony Blair, and they just sold and exported all this cheap stuff. And by doing that, they are now where they are today. In your case, you've got this trajectory of like the next 40 years of a bunch of a much older, slower growing countries who are looking for new investment frontiers, who need different services, turn that to your own advantage, just the way China did, with a ruthless, focused sequential strategy, not necessarily getting the lithium. I think China is investing in a top steel factory somewhere in Zimbabwe now, like a brand new one. Maybe not a lithium battery factory so far. So I just think don't throw all of that is true, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like work out how to use the baby, so to speak, for your own purposes, just as what China did. And even on the corruption, try and work out, just as China did, to even incentivize the corruption so that at least it works for growth. Like at least the corruption and growth are correlated positively. That's it. Yeah, I hope that was helpful.
Thanks for that, Lauren. Deborah, in the shortest possible time, can you just react and also give your closing remark there?
Well, I won't say very much at all because I thought Lauren just said it beautifully there, but I just echo what she said. Think about where Zimbabwe wants to be in 2050, 2060, 2070, because you have the opportunity now. And when you think of where Zimbabwe was, you guys used to be the grain basket of Southern Africa. You were exporting from Zimbabwe, a landlocked country, to countries in Southeast Asia. You were so prosperous. And those days can come back again with the right kind of government in place and the right kind of strategies, because the people of Zimbabwe are incredibly talented. You have it. It's just getting that together with the better governance and the strategic governance. So I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you a lot for those responses. At this moment in time, I would also like to thank our esteemed panelists, Honorable Mkaratigwa, Dr. Sila, Patrick Anam, Professor Brotigam, as well as Dr. Johnston for helping us unpack Chinese investments, transparency and debt within the African continent, as well as within Zimbabwe. Wasting much of our time, I'll call upon Thierry to give us a wrap-up and then also a roadmap for tomorrow. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Adrian. Firstly, we really want to apologize for eating into your time. I think we struggled somehow, but also the discussions, I think they were very rich and interesting, and we've managed to keep you in here. So it has been a heavy day. Rich presentations from all our presenters and panelists, and also our contributions from the floor. Thank you very much. I will not try to go through all the notes that I jotted here for the sake of time, but thank you very much. Anyway, we will share the report at the end of the conference. But let me thank you again, and see you tomorrow. I think tomorrow we'll try to start very early so that we don't keep you after the 4 in terms of finishing time. I'm not sure if my colleagues from admin have anything to say. Nothing? Yeah, they are here. She's coming. Yeah. She's coming. Yeah, I have been instructed to share with you the following. So, all the reinvestments and obligations will be sorted out tomorrow. Here I'm specifically looking at the dinner allowances, the incidental allowances, as mentioned in the logistical note. So they'll be ready tomorrow. And on the COVID test, yeah, we are still facing resistance from some participants who are afraid to get tested. So we would encourage all our participants to come forward and get tested. It's for all of us, it's for the safety of all of us. For those who have been tested today, I think only positive results will be communicated. So if you don't hear from us, you are okay. But yeah, let's keep the environment safe. Let's continue to mask up, sanitize, and social distance. Thank you very much, and good evening. Thank you. Yeah?